Yesterday, where I presented A Night with the Industrious Fleas in Douglas Jerrold's Illustrated Magazine, I neglected to mention a little smoking gun or a little intuition that I had about it. And that got me to thinking about examples of little smoking guns where plagiarists made mistakes and they can be caught out. So first I'll deal with that one, and then I'll go into some other ones. I think smoking guns are kind of fun. Now, you have to have a lot of little smoking guns if you want to really prove something, and I'm not going to show all of them. So some of these are not going to be proof in and of themselves. There are actually big ones, and there's one big one in A Christmas Carol, which I'm presenting in the article that's coming out very soon in Real Paranormal Magazine, and in about a month will be posted in Academia EDU. And there's another one in The Lost Bower, which Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, stole from Mathew Franklin Whittier. There are also some little smoking guns in the weekly or daily and weekly New York Tribune, where Margaret Fuller falsely claimed Matthew's reviews and essays, which he signed with his accustomed star, and I am going to show you a couple of those since I've already done it. But here in Douglas Jerrold's Illustrated Magazine, where we have the industrious fleas, I've shown you that before, we have the little section that I read for you, which is the social commentary part, where the flea that he sees or hallucinates in the middle of the night sitting on his bed tells him about flea society. And I'll read the paragraph in question. Allow me to introduce you to His Most Vindictive Majesty, our Emperor. Ours is a mixed constitution, and we don't acknowledge the sovereign to have more than a qualified power. The only real distinction that he possesses is that he is allowed to suck a little more blood than any one of his subjects. And then it says, do you perceive any analogy between the royal prerogatives of men and fleas? He. Matthew wouldn't have written that. Matthew did not tell his readers that he was indulging in an analogy or a metaphor. The man that plagiarized this, who signed as Pierre Shafton, wasn't sure that the audience would get it, see? So he had to tell them that they were about to see an analogy. Matthew never did that. So that's a little tiny, teensy-weensy smoking gun, which shows that the plagiarist, what did I just say, plagiarizer? The plagiarist has slipped in a little something because he has to dumb it down for a general audience. This is what Charles Dickens did with A Christmas Carol. He dumbed it down, and I have proof positive of that, which I will be showing visually as well as by description in my article. Now, we got a bunch of examples here, and where are we going to start? I've got notes, but the question is trying to make it some kind of a coherent narrative with a beginning and an end, and, this is going to be really complicated. So let's go back to something I mentioned. This is Light's, George W. Light's Keep Cool, Go Ahead, and a few other poems. But he stole just about everything in here, with a couple exceptions, from Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abby Whittier's early poetry. It's a little tiny book. He was a publisher. Mostly he published things like, he's got one that he published, which is a scream. It's convincing young men why they should stay celibate for the first year or so of marriage. Good luck with that, yeah? So he, in other words, he put on an exaggerated aura of sanctity when he really was a scoundrel. Apparently, he was a friend of Albert Pike, who did exactly the same thing. See, so these people, these sociopaths and scoundrels, put on an air of sanctity. Charles Dickens did exactly the same thing with his great philanthropy and social reform and so on. See, they wear it as a disguise. Now, let's get into The Essayist, where a lot of these poems that George W. Light stole, as well as Albert Pike, are originally seen. And this will cross-reference us back into Matthew and his work as Franklin Jr. And it'll also take us briefly here to The Raven. I mean, there's a lot of intersections in here. This essayist, this was a young man's magazine edited by George W. Light with quite a bit of work from Matthew in it, even though this is published 1833. The work goes from, I think, 1831 to 33. Matthew was in New York most of this time, and the essayist is in Boston, but Matthew contributed to it. So here I think this is the September edition, is an essay signed Franklin Jr. called Poetry of Francis Quarles. It's a two-part article. You can see it. I'll hold it up long enough that you can screen capture it if you're so inclined. And mostly it's a quote. He says, "The following is extracted from a quaint ancient book," meaning an antiquarian volume, "written by this gentleman. I may give a more particular notice of it next month, Franklin Jr." And it's a fairly lengthy poem. I won't read so much today. I think that's padding the length of these things. "False world, thou liest. Thou canst not lend the least delight. Thy favors cannot gain a friend. They are so slight." And so on. So Matthew is reading or quoting Francis Quarles, the poet, from an original antiquarian volume. Now, he was poor. Where would he get the money for an antiquarian volume? He got that from Abby, I would guess, that she got it as a present or it was in her family library because her family was upper class. So she had lent it to Matthew. I think that Francis Quarles was Abby's favorite. I think she quoted him. I think when they got into arguments, she would quote him. And I think that Matthew, with his typical wry sense of humor, dubbed her Abby Quarles, being a play on the word quarrels. And that when he submitted The Raven to American Review in 1845, blank Quarles means Abby Quarles, which means that that poem was dedicated to Abby because, of course, it was written in grief for her. A lot of that's, I mean, it's extrapolation and intuition, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. That is right down the line, Matthew's sense of humor, to call her Abby Quarles. And then again, he does that again. I don't think I have that one marked, or maybe I do. Let's see if I have it marked. Because he comes back to that subject again. Here it is. I don't know which edition this is. I didn't mark it. Poetry of Francis Quarles. Antiquities of Literature, Poetry of Francis Quarles. It's also signed Franklin Jr. I'll hold it up here if anybody's so inclined to screen capture that. Hopefully some of it's readable. So Matthew had an interest in Francis Quarles going all the way back to 1831. He used hundreds of different pseudonyms, most of them meaningful in some way or another. Hidden code or something. Edgar Allan Poe didn't use pseudonyms. There's one that's a variation on his name or something that he used once. He didn't use pseudonyms. And he had no possible reason to like Francis Quarles because Francis Quarles is deeply religious and austere, and Edgar Allan Poe is not. Despite the fact that he stole grieving widowers' religious poems and published them under his own name, that doesn't make him religious. And anybody can, sound religious in a letter, still doesn't make him religious. All right, now that's that, but let's move on here because there's poems that were first seen in The Essayist, which show up in Light's Keep Cool, Go Ahead, and a few other poems. So here we have, and again, silly me, I didn't write down which months these relate to, but here we have a poem signed with the editor's initials called Marriage. And it shows up once again in Light's volume called Heart Union, and it's been revised somewhat. This, I'm telling you definitely, is Abby's poem. And if you'll recall, I said that in the very first volume, on the first page of the Carpetbag, 1851 Carpetbag, the very first edition, on the first page, is a little little essay or a little report on N.P. Willis's thoughts about women proposing. That entire first page is Matthew writing in tribute to Abby, including one of the stories that they wrote together called The Wags. This is Abby's poem broadly hinting to Matthew that they're going to be married someday. Because as a young girl, this is like 1831. She was born in 1816. She's just a kid here. But she knows, she's psychic, and she knows they're going to be married. Here she says, but like two stars from a dim cloud descending. So this I hadn't even noticed this. This is where Matthew got the star signature from. She is in fact saying that they're twin souls, but she's couching it as twin stars. I didn't even realize I had that reference in there. Okay, I just felt it and assumed it, but here she says it in black and white. She speaks of them as two stars. Well, he put his own initials to this thing here. Let's see. There's more things by Franklin Jr. Here's one called The Man of Circumstance. There's a lion in the way. He says, I am your man of circumstance, he says. I never ask the sun to stand still, nor try to control a thunderbolt. I approve of the order of the heavens. This is basically Matthew's answer to quietude or astrology or anything that would suggest that he not strive, see? So that's signed by him. Just to give you an idea what Franklin Jr. was writing in here, there's Francis Quarles, the second part. Now, this is an unsigned poem, which also appears in much modified form in Light's book. Light's book is published, I can't remember, it's 1850, 1853, somewhere in there. This is called The Still Small Voice. And I've read it to you before in one of these video blogs. I'll just hold it up here and maybe you can see it. I read it before. The still small voice, the still small voice, hear ye not when the morning breaks over the distant mountains, and each bird in the woodland wakes, while the sunlight gleams on the lakes and the silvery fountains? A voice in the radiant sky, in the grove's rich melody? The Spirit of God is nigh. Man, make thy choice, oh, make thy choice. That's the way that Abby wrote, and she used that double exclamation format. Now here, when they turn up in George W. Light's, let's see, where is that? Darn it if I didn't mark that one. Well, he takes out that double exclamation. Here it is, a still small voice, and he writes, hear ye not when the sunrise breaks on the misty mountains and the song of the morning wakes as it gleams on the silent lakes and the silvery fountains? The speech of the purple sky with the music wafting by, the Spirit is hovering nigh. With the earliest dawn comes the still small voice. So he took out the urgent call to action. He took out the exclamation at the beginning, the still small voice, and he took out the call to action, man, make thy choice. That's because he's a crook and he has no real interest in these things. Now, when we get back to marriage, he now calls it heart union. But there's a little smoking gun in heart union. This is reason that I wanted to look at it. Little tiny thing. He copied this over and he miscopied it because he retained it in 1852 or 3. He retained the mistake. And it's in parentheses. She didn't have it in parentheses originally in the essayist. What I'll have to do is just stop the video and find it. But let me do that. I'll stop the video here for a second, and then I'll come back and I'll have it. Magically, I will have it. Okay, I'm back. I actually had it marked. I just missed it. So in this poem, Marriage, which is signed GWL for George W. Light, there is a line that says, left not to wander with not where to roam or seek a darker sphere. So she's talking about spirits, the spirits of the two soulmates or twin stars. And when their spirits leave this earthly home, left not to wander with not where to roam or seek a darker sphere. Well, obviously that's nowhere to roam. And back in 1831, it was written as two words. It wasn't a conjunctive. So that's the right word. I don't know my English grammar. I just know how to write. Not where to roam is supposed to be two words, nowhere to roam. And he's retained it in 1852 or whenever this was published. Here he has it in parentheses, left not to wander with not where to roam or find a darker sphere. This, of course, is spiritualism. It means that when they die, they don't go into the darker astral realms. They go up into the higher astral realms. See, this is not a traditional Christian, and George W. Light supposedly was a traditional Christian, so he would not have written esoteric poetry, you see, but he didn't know what it was. He didn't really understand it. He just copied it over. So I think maybe you can see it here. So that's just a flat out mistake. There's one exactly like it, or very much like it, in The Lost Bower, which Elizabeth Barrett Browning ripped off from Matthew for her first book of poetry, poems. I'll be presenting that in my article. I won't present that today. But let's go back to the poem, which shows up in here, called Keep at Work. And I'll just read the first stanza. Does a mountain on you frown? Keep at work. You may undermine it yet. If you stand and thump its base, sorry bruises you may get. Keep at work. This is Matthew. Matthew is a Stoic philosopher. He's determined to keep trying to succeed. Of course, he doesn't, and there's lots of reasons for that. Same with myself. Basically, he's way too far ahead of his time, and he hides his light under a bushel, and people steal his work, but he himself doesn't succeed. But what he's saying here is that he's going to keep on. Well, that was written very early, I think, or relatively early, but it shows up first. The very first time I can find it is in the Weekly Chronotype, and it's signed Franklin. George W. Light never signed Franklin, even if he was trying to, make a point that it was like what Benjamin Franklin would say. He never signed with anything other than his own name, and he signed quite a bit of stuff under his own name in the papers and also personally. So here, I don't know if you can see it. Let's see, it's on this side. That poem, Keep at Work, signed Franklin in all caps. That was Matthew's poem. George W. Light very quickly started publishing it under his own name in other papers and in a book, and then in his book. And then he wrote a knockoff called Keep Cool, Go Ahead, which the critics panned as being trivial, which it was. He wrote a trivial knockoff of Matthew's poem, Keep at Work, not understanding the philosophy behind it, really. In Light's version, you just stay cool, man. No matter what happens, you just stay cool. That's what he thought it was, see? So this is typical of the plagiarists. They don't really understand the depth of the work, and they copy mistakes, and they don't realize they're mistakes. So these guys make little errors, and I'm going to show you some more of them. Some of them are compelling in and of themselves. Some of them are compelling in context with a whole bunch of other clues. Most of them are that way. The blunder that Charles Dickens made in A Christmas Carol stands on its own. It's awful. Wait till you see it. I can't believe that other people haven't picked up on this thing and thought it through. You just don't see what you're not looking for. It's amazing. Let me see. Where are we going to go here? Because there's a lot of different places to go. Franklin. Now, in The Essayist, where Matthew is signing as Franklin, this is not so much a mistake, but it's a smoking gun. It's a little smoking gun. Sometimes little smoking guns can actually, if you look close at them, turn out to be big smoking guns. And I'll show you a little example of that that I videotaped many years ago. I used to have a tape that was just called Tapestry, a videotape. And I would just put things on it that I thought they were just neat. Went back to my days as a photographer. And I thought, well, this is just cool. I might have a use for it someday. So this is one example of that. Now, in the essayist. And I don't know right off. I could put it up as a graphic if it matters to anybody. I don't know which month this is. It's called Sketches of Character, a Schemer. And then there's a quote, which Matthew typically quoted poetry. Ne'er was there an idle brain, but bred an idle thought. And it's attributed old poem, which is Matthew's sense of humor. He liked to do that every once in a while. This is a dialogue between two archetypal characters. It's signed Franklin Jr. One of them is S for schemer, and one of them is F, presumably for the author. S says, see, this is basically Matthew talking to a sociopath, or Matthew talking to an irresponsible young man, okay? Schemer, S, you needn't preach to me. I've lived long enough to know a thing or two, and you needn't try to crowd your superstition into me. I don't want anybody to show me how to get along in the world. Give me an equal chance with the rest, and I'll take care of number one. And then F says, I'm glad I've met you, my young schemer, but you needn't be afraid of my preaching to you. I know a good deal better than to do that. A sound whipping is what you want before you'll be properly, quote, settled. You talk about having lived long enough to know a thing or two. What's the reason you haven't found out that you are a fool yet? I needn't try to crowd my superstition into you, you say. You wouldn't advise me to put even dirty water into a broken kettle, would you? You don't want anybody to show you how to get along in the world. Of course, you haven't got sense enough to know the utility of advice, but I'll show you down my argumentative stairs. You'll take care of number one. You'd better look out to get 1 ounce of sense. Then you may know a little more of yourself and the subject of providence in placing you in this world. And they go back and forth like that. This Matthew's quite brash at this age. See, we're talking, 18, 19, he's a brash young man. But there's a reason why I bring this up. And that is that in the Dial, where Matthew Franklin Whittier, not Margaret Fuller, the Dial is the Transcendentalist magazine. All I have is printed copies because you can't buy these things. Matthew is signing reviews primarily as F. It's not Margaret Fuller, who is the editor and who is not signing at all. Her stuff is unsigned. But there's a smoking gun in here, and that is that this roughly runs during the period of Abby's last illness and her death. It's a monthly. I think it's a monthly or quarterly. Maybe it's quarterly. So in the April 1841 edition, Abby had just died on March 27. Just like days before this thing probably was due, So he wouldn't have been able to write anything. But there is an F-signed piece in here. And what is it? It's called a dialogue, poet, critic. And it has the poet speaking with the critic. I swear what Matthew has done, he couldn't write anything for the magazine. He went back to a piece that he'd written for the essayist like 10 years earlier and just gave it to him. And instead of signing Franklin Jr., they just signed with the accustomed F. Here's the F signature on this. It's only 3 pages long. Most of his submissions under the signature F for the Dial are, one of them's like 56 pages long, I think. They're long. And there's another dialogue in here, and I tell you what's happening. I mean, I know looking at it that Matthew comes after, he couldn't write. So what he did was he pretended that Abby was there with him discussing this thing because she would help him write and they would discuss the subject. He split himself into himself and Abby and gave each one of them a name and imagined that she was helping him write it. That's why that's a dialogue. This one, I'm going to read just a little bit of it. You can see the similarity with the other one I just read from the essayist. Poet, approach me not, man of cold, steadfast eye and compressed lips. At thy coming, nature shrouds herself in dull mist. Fain would she hide her sighs and smiles, her buds and fruits, even in a veil of snow. For thy unkindly breath, as it pierces her mystery, destroys its creative power. The birds draw back into their nests. The sunset hues into their clouds, when you are seen in the distance with your tablets all ready to write them into prose. That's the poet speaking to the critic. The critic says, "Oh, my brother, my benefactor, do not thus repel me. Interpret me rather to our common mother. Let her not avert her eyes from a younger child. I know I can never be dear to her as thou art, yet I am her child, nor would the fated revolutions of existence be fulfilled without my aid." It goes on. This is the same voice. All Matthew has done is to go into his portfolio and grab something that he'd written for the essayist along the same lines as his previous dialogue between the schemer and F, and just pulled it out and sent it to him. So that's another little smoking gun. Let's move on here. Let's see. I don't believe I've exhausted everything I've got. Oh, here we go. Francis Durabage and George Burnham. These guys are something else, okay? Durabage really was a real sociopath, I believe, and I do have a master's in counseling, so I have a little credentials to say that. George Burnham was a crook. He was an opportunist, and they teamed up, and I'm pretty darn sure from all the clues that they tricked Matthew into signing away the rights to his entire portfolio, which they proceeded to get rich off of by publishing piecemeal and then in books. And then they both got editorships out of it and reputations, which reputations continue to this day, and which I am going to try to do something about. Now, Matthew, from very, very early on, and this is where I'm going to have to refer to my notes, he started experimenting with dialect. Yankee dialect. He was the first to write in America in Yankee dialect, I believe, with his Joe Strickland character. When he ran away from home, he created a character who had also run away from home to the big city, from the small town farms to the big city. And he called him Joe Strickland, and he wrote in horrible spelling with dialect and everything, and that's Matthew. It's been attributed to, it's a long story. The scholars got that one wrong. I won't go into that. So Matthew started with that, and he continued, and not just Yankee dialect, but he did Irish, he did sailors, he did blacks early on until he felt that it was supporting the pro-slavery movement, and he stopped doing it. But, he treated them all the same, with a light, wry humor, not a heavy, vicious humor. It was just intended to have a little fun. Irish, Scotch, Dutch, and French. Now, he has some very early ones in French dialect. And here's one, the November 6th, 1829, in the New England Galaxy, which Matthew had been publishing in since 1825 when he was 12 years old. This one's called A Quandary. In this newspaper, his go-to signature was NNK. I suspect it means never, never know, meaning it's deeply hidden anonymous. But I don't know. But anyway, the NNK in the Galaxy is one of Matthew's signatures, his kind of go-to signature. And he has French dialect there. There's another one in the New York Constellation, which Matthew edited for Asa Green. That's in the November 26, 1831 edition. So Matthew had been writing in French dialect for years. And it starts showing up in the portfolio, in the pieces from Matthew's portfolio that Francis A. Durabage and George P. Burnham stole. It's in their books, when they wrote their compilations. But there's one very strange little smoking gun about that. This is very difficult to write in this style. It's a specialty that Matthew was particularly good at, writing in dialect. Not everybody could do it. I wouldn't be able to do it today unless I was just pulling words out of his, but to sit down myself and try to imitate French dialect. Now, Abby was, French, raised French. So he had, I think a lot of this comes from Abby's father, listening to him. He must have had a pretty thick accent. So he'd been doing this for years. These guys had no credentials for that, for writing in dialect, and yet their work is full of Matthew's dialect, see? But this writing in French dialect is a specialty. Francis Durivage presumably was of French heritage. I don't know which generation he was. He was born in Boston. But I think he didn't particularly like the ones that made fun of Frenchmen not being able to speak English. So when they divvied up this portfolio, he gave all of the French ones to George Burnham. Well, there's no reason in the world why George Burnham would have any facility in this particular style, see? I mean, if you look at his writing, he can't do that, you know? He's not really a writer. He wrote a few books, but he's not really a writer. So all of them went to George Burnham, except one, and that is a little smoking gun. This is called Zat Is My Trunk. It's in Stray Subjects Arrested and Bound Over, being the fugitive offspring of the olden and young'un that have been lying around loose and are now tied up for fast keeping. This was a joke. They're fugitive offspring because it says stray subject arrested and bound over. In other words, they're crooks and they stole this thing from Matthew's portfolio and they're bragging on it as a joke. Well, anyway, here, this piece, and these things are full of indications of Matthew's authorship. One of them is it starts out, in the days of coaching over the Providence Turnpike, before railroad cars were in S and baggage crates existed, and when travelers had to keep a sharp lookout for their luggage, some 40 or 50 passengers had just stepped on board the old, quote, Ben Franklin and got underway on Narragansett Bay. Well, Matthew would slip in Ben Franklin at the slightest opportunity because he admired Benjamin Franklin, his namesake, so much. So that's one little clue. Another one is that we have the spelling Leetle, L-E-E-T-L-E, for little. This is one of Matthew's trademark spellings. And I ran it in my database. Let's see. Here's my tally. In Matthew's works alone, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 82 examples of Leetle show up in Matthew's work. And in the Durivage and Burnham works that they stole from Matthew, there are 17 examples of Leetle. In Ethan Spike alone, there are 51. That's Matthew's flagship series. In an earlier one, Enoch Timbertoes, there are 7. And in his original Joe Strickland series, I found 1. There's also one in a piece in the Constellation, New York Constellation, April 16, 1831, with the character Henrietta Huckabuck. And this also has Leetle. Matthew wrote that. And the reason I bring that in is that this is a character very much like Mrs. Partington. I said that Matthew wrote Mrs. Partington, not her, but wrote a character like Mrs. Partington who gets everything wrong, you know. Only he wrote her in heavy dialect like Joe Strickland. but it's a Mrs. Partington-like character. Matthew went way back with all of these things. You know, the people that got famous for them were by no means the innovators. So there's other people that picked up Leetle, like Natur, N-A-T-U-R-E-R, but Matthew was first with these things, see? It can't be, Charles Dickens even wrote with some of these things, but he's later. See, this is before Charles Dickens. So it's a question to me whether Charles Dickens could have read the New York Constellation. I don't dare claim it, but I did check into it with the British Library, and they told me they do have a full set of the New York Constellation in the British Library. They don't know when it was donated or how they got it, but they said it was possible for people to get private subscriptions to it. They said it's unlikely it would have been in reading rooms at the time, but people could get subscriptions. So I suspect that when Charles Dickens was writing very frivolous social commentary, social comedies, that he was reading Matthew's work in the New York Constellation and got inspired by it. That's a theory. Okay, so that took us astray a little bit. But the real point of this thing with the French dialect is Francis Durivage, by taking one of them, which is relatively not that sarcastic toward Frenchmen, because the Frenchman wins in this one, turns out to be the hero in this one, see, so he liked that one. That means that both of these men, or each of these men, are claiming to be able to write in this very specialized genre of French dialect. They both claim equal skill in this, which is very unlikely. It's possible that Durivage said, boy, you know, George, I really like this French stuff that you're doing. I'm going to try my hand at it once. Possible, but I don't think so. Especially because George Burnham showed there's no reason to believe that George Burnham could write like that. And the ones that he published were quite a bit more complicated. Now, I think I've got one more that I want to do, and that is Margaret Fuller and the star in the New York Weekly Tribune. Now, keep in mind that Matthew was writing reviews as the star, and you see why he picked up the star, because Abby believed that they were twin stars, and she says so in black and white in that poem. So after she died, he would write, at times, not always, signing with the star, which means that he was the remaining star on Earth of the two. But he had written as a single star in the reviews for the Essayist back in 1831-32. I can't remember which year he started with it. I don't know if I need to show you one of those. I can put one up on the screen for you. The reviews are always toward the end. Here we go. Here's an example of one up at there'd be two or three, but up at the top of this page, there is one of those star-signed reviews, and that's, I think, 1832 or 3. So Matthew goes way back with that signature. Margaret Fuller didn't have any history with that signature at all. Okay, so here we have the New York Weekly Tribune. This is the February 26th, 1845 edition. I'll hold it up here to the screen. And we have in here a review. This may be a repeat for some of you if you've watched one of the earlier ones. The Child's Friend, designed for families and Sunday schools, edited by Eliza L. Folan, Boston, Leonard C. Bowles. That is the book that Matthew is going to be reviewing. And keep in mind that this is a children's book. Matthew goes on, he talks about his standard for children's books, that he likes it when authors write things that children are really interested in instead of talking down to them like they're, substandard little citizens. He talks to them as people about things that they're interested in. And in 1863, when he wrote Harry Lee, The Tempter and the Tempted, signed with his initials, MFW, that's exactly what he did. He wrote a gripping adventure story, or would be gripping for boys, in their own language and, in ways that they would understand, but he didn't talk down to them. So that's what he's advocating here. But every once in a while in these columns, the writer will get personal, autobiographical, and that's where we can catch Margaret Fuller, because these things went right on through. The reason they went through is that she didn't start claiming this right away. She did to her aunt in a letter. Her aunt, when she first got there and started working as the literary editor for the Tribune, her aunt apparently had asked her, "Are you the star?" And she had said yes. So when she was asked, she would say yes. But she didn't really start claiming it publicly until much later, when a rumor developed that she must be the star. And as I said yesterday, she apparently blushingly acquiesced. Oh, yes, yes, you're right. You've caught me. I was the star. Well, she didn't really claim it all along. So that means that she was not being really careful to screen out autobiographical references that didn't fit for her. Okay, so here we have, "Oh, that winter, freezing, snow-laden winter, which slowly ushered in our 8th birthday. There in the lonely farmhouse, the day's work done, and the bright wood fire and below, we were permitted to slide back the panel of the cupboard in the wall." And then he goes on, "Most fascinating object still in our eyes, with which no stateliest alcoved library can vie. And there we saw, neatly ranged on its 2 shelves, not, praised be our natal star, Peter Parley, nor a history of the good little boy that never took anything that did not belong to him, but the Spectator, Telemachus, Goldsmith's Animated Nature, and the Iliad." Now, This is Matthew talking about his childhood and what was in the Whittier farmhouse to read. Okay, so Fuller was born May 23, 1810. It's not her. It can't possibly, unless she's lying outright, it can't possibly be her because she was born in May. Horace Greeley was born February 3, 1811. He was born in the winter and he was raised in a farmhouse. Matthew was born July 18, 1812 in the summer. So if you want to be literal, this would have to have been much more likely written by Horace Greeley than by Margaret Fuller. So at the very least, we have now proven, another little smoking gun, we have now proven that Fuller did not write this piece. If she didn't write this one, there's every possibility she didn't write some of the other ones. But then there's a couple things that indicate that it was Matthew and not Greeley. It's now between Matthew and Greeley, see? But first of all, Matthew, when he would write anything autobiographical, he had a habit of throwing in a monkey wrench, throwing in a red herring that would distract his enemies so that they wouldn't suspect it was him, because he was doing a lot of very dangerous undercover anti-slavery work with the Underground Railroad and with William Lloyd Garrison and the other abolitionists there. You know, his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, was a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He would go to the meetings there in New York. I have evidence for that. And he didn't dare get exposed. This is why he didn't come out and challenge Edgar Allan Poe when Edgar Allan Poe falsely claimed the Raven. So he would, and I've caught him at this 2 or 3 times, he would deliberately lie about his own childhood or his own past. He would, like there's another example, there's a travelogue signed ABD. I believe it's in the Chronotype or maybe it's in the Boston Weekly Museum. And he's visiting this area right down the street here, Woodford's Corner and Stevens Plains, which is just like half a mile from where I'm sitting, that way. And he claims to have gone to school there. Well, he didn't go to school there. And it threw me off when I first was studying that. I said, I'm sure this is Matthew. I'm sure, for one thing, ABD writes a Ethan Spike type satire on military musters. And I said, well, this is Matthew right down the line. And then I get to this thing about the school, that he went to school. I said, well, it can't be him. So in my first book, I just give up, you know. Well, it was him, but he was throwing that in there to throw off the people. He probably had death threats. He probably lived with death threats. So he's doing the same thing here. He's purposely throwing in a birthday that wouldn't fit him, but he's also throwing in a birthday that wouldn't fit Margaret Fuller. And I think that that was on purpose, you know, to put people on notice. This is not Margaret Fuller, because she must have been trying to claim it by that time. So that's one little smoking gun there. And it goes on. I looked at all the books that are described in here, and I matched them up with what is said in the Whittier legacy to have been in the Whittier farmhouse and what is said to have been in the Greeley farmhouse. And it looks like it matches much more closely what was in the Whittier farmhouse, including the Iliad and so on, that the Whittiers did have that. And there is a mention that apparently they both had about the same amount of books in the family. There's one other line in here. It says, the day's work done. Well, the only time that Margaret Fuller ever ended up in a farmhouse, apparently, was when she visited her grandmother for the holidays. But her grandmother wouldn't have her doing the day's work. This is a privileged kind of snooty girl who felt like she was slumming it, even living with at the house of the Greeleys, who were middle class. See, her grandmother wouldn't have had her doing a day's work. She might have had her, you know, do the dishes or something like that, you know, some little chore, but not a day's work. So it's definitely not Margaret Fuller. And why didn't scholars pick up on this stuff? Again, because they're not looking, I guess. I mean, you don't see what you don't want to see. I have tried to force myself to see things that didn't fit my theories. You know, I mean, I really did that. And there were times when I had to revise my assumptions about Matthew's history, because I forced myself not to ignore those things, partly because I knew I'd be caught later on, but partly just out of an attempt to try to be rigorous. Now here's another one. I won't say it's the second one. There are other ones. This is the New York Weekly Tribune of August 30, 1845. We have a column here on this side called the Great Britain. The Great Britain was a brand new huge steamship which had just docked there in New York City, and the star-signed writer goes to tour it. Well, some of it sounds like it could have been written by a woman. The Great Britain, notwithstanding the long preparation of our minds, we were struck with admiration and delight by a view of the vast steamship. Once again, we envied him of whose thought this is the full-grown offspring, and when admitted to see the apparatus of heart and lungs, felt that if man, capital M, is no longer a giant, he is at least the creator of giants. It is a proud feeling to tread these decks from end to end. Indeed, to be proud for those who steer her mighty path upon the ocean. That's not a woman, first of all. Secondly, heart and lungs. That can only be one thing. That's the engine room. A woman in 1845 would not be invited to tour the engine room of a steamship. It's possible, but even a plucky tomboy, she would not have been invited, nor would she have really enjoyed it, but she would not have been invited to tour the engine room. So this is also one of Matthew's favorite literary devices of being favorably or pleasantly surprised, which he couches in a whole bunch of different ways. But this is typical. I could show you 4 or 5 different examples of Matthew saying he would call it like pleasantly disappointed, that he was disappointed, and then he would say it was better even than he expected. So he loved to open up a piece with that. So that's also typical Matthew. But Margaret Fuller was not invited to tour the heart and lungs of a steamship. So that's another little smoking gun. There's a bunch more. I mean, I've only just touched on some of them. There's other ones. There's one more that I had planned on talking about here. So let's get into that. This has to do with Albert Pike's plagiarism of young Abby Poyen's work. Okay. And this gets very complicated. But let's go back to the essayist, if I can find it, and look for Ode to the Mockingbird. Okay. This poem, this version of this poem, was not actually claimed by Albert Pike. He wrote a biographer that he had written Ode to the Mockingbird 2 days after his marriage. But this is 1832. He was married in 1834. So this had been published 2 years before he claimed to have written it after his marriage. But that was a totally reworked version. It was not a different poem. It was clearly the same poem, but it was completely reworked. And he called it To the Mockingbird. But originally, I believe he said Ode to the Mockingbird. So there's a confusion about the titles. So in this compilation, which was put together by his family after his death, this one, we have 2 poems. One is Ode to the Mockingbird, and one is To the Mockingbird. Now let me get all 3 of these where I can look at them, because his family swapped the titles. This is called Ode to the Mockingbird, 1832, in the Essayist. That's this one. And it begins, O bird who dwellest in the lonely woods, far from all cities where men dream of life, walking with blinded eyes, and dull care broods upon their withered hearts, and angry strife flaps her broad wings before the eyes of men, and gnaws upon their souls, and so on. Abby did not like cities. She saw them as dens of iniquity, Babylon, basically. She was old school Victorian as well as being esoteric. So the poem that Albert Pike claimed to have written 2 days after his marriage, 2 years later, is based on it, but it's loosely based. So here we have, in his family has given this the title of Ode to the Mockingbird, but this is actually, I think they've swapped the titles. Thou glorious mocker of the world, I hear thy many voices ringing through the glooms of these green solitudes. and all the clear, bright joyance of their song enthralls the ear. And there's a line in here about happy birds, I think, which I'm like, eesh, you know. It's the level. This is Pike on his own, see. But then let's clarify that this was based on the other one. Glad scorner of all cities, thou dost leave the world's mad turmoil and incessant din, where none in others' honesty believe, where the old sigh, the young turn gray and grieve, where misery gnaws the maiden's heart within, etc., etc. So there's no reason to talk about, in other words, this is a reworked version of the one that appeared in the essay. It's very heavily reworked. Now here's his slightly less reworked version of the original poem. And so here he says, sweet bird, thou singest in the lonely woods, far from great cities. Let's see how that compares. She begins, O bird, who dwellest in the lonely woods, far from all cities where men dream of life. I'll mark that. And he writes, in the one that's not so heavily revised, sweet bird, thou singest in the lonely woods, far from great cities. There men dream of life. So this is the poem that Abby originally wrote that appeared in the Essayist, which his family has given the wrong name. They've given it the name To the Mockingbird. The one that has the same title is the one that he heavily reworked for his marriage 2 years later in 1834. This poem, Ode to the Mockingbird, in the Essayist, is signed A.P., which, aside from being Albert Pike's initials, are also Abby Ployan's initials. So that's an interesting little thing. It took me a while to figure out that Pike had twice revised this poem and once claimed to have written it 2 years later. But he actually had the other one as well, see? So it's not absolute proof, but there's other indicators. It's not the only one. So there's some of the little smoking guns that I found in the course of my work. There are other ones. I didn't even get into the question of quails and Osh and Dodge because I've already shown the evidence for that. Mostly are things where Matthew has slipped up and left a little trace of himself, But seems to me, with Osh and Dodge, the big mistake that Osh and Dodge made is just the premise. That guy couldn't write. He couldn't even write his own songs. He was a singer, and he didn't write his own songs. He had contests. He was wealthy from all of his performance. He was like a rock star, or a comedic star. And he advertised for contests in the newspaper, and then he would take the best one and make that one of his songs. And I think that Matthew ghost wrote for him as well. So it wasn't even his material. There is nothing in the world that would indicate that Matthew could write as well as those travelogues under quails in the Boston Weekly Museum, as there is no earthly reason why he would be invited to meet with Victor Hugo in his home in Paris. It's a goof. It's a total goof that Osh and Dodge could possibly be the real author of the Quails travelogue in the Weekly Museum. And I absolutely proved that Matthew was the author because I found him in a drawing, in Exeter Hall in London during the World Peace Congress. He's there in the press box just like he says he is, and it's Matthew. So that one is proven way beyond any reasonable doubt. So there's no reason to go into that too much. But why do historians believe that it was Osh and Dodge? Because Osh and Dodge and the editor colluded to say that it was. First, the editor, Charles A.V. Putnam, started hinting it. And actually, one of the other contributors first got the idea because the itineraries between Osh and Dodge and Quails, who was traveling, seemed to match up. They match up because Matthew was traveling with Dodge. It's clear that they were friends because Matthew writes about that in one of his Ethan Spike type characters in the Weekly Museum. And Jedediah Simpkins was the name of the character, and he writes about meeting and becoming friends with Osh and Dodge. See, so we know Matthew was personal friends with him for a while. And I think Matthew was ghostwriting for him. There's one routine that's described that Osh and Dodge did where he was imitating the facial expressions of people who saw Niagara Falls for the first time. And as soon as I saw that, I got a pretty strong past life hit. That was my gig. That was my gag. I wrote that. That was my idea. Because I do have memory on that level of creativity. The higher mind and its creativity, that still comes through. I'm still the same person on that level. I'm not the same personality because I don't have the same life experience, but on the higher mind where creativity happens, I'm the same person. So I recognized that as my idea. So I knew that Matthew had been ghostwriting for him, but I basically was able to prove that one too, because there's one section, let's see if I can remember this. It's kind of convoluted. Ashendaj's father gets ill and dies, and he has to break off from his itinerary and go and attend his father. While he's there, this is somewhere in the middle of New York, Montezuma, I think it's called. So while he's there, he gives a concert in Rochester, New York. And Quails talks about it. At least he hints at it, because he says that he, Quails, saw a Boston boy perform in the area, while he was up there, because he was right in the same area. He's like in Ashendaj's hometown, of Montezuma or wherever it was nearby there, while his father's dying. Quails is there. You would think that was proof positive that Quails was Ashendaj, but no, Matthew was traveling with him. And Quails says, while I was there, I saw a Boston boy perform. Well, the Boston boy is Ashendaj, and Quails saw him. So Quails is not him. Quails saw him. Then I had to look and see if I could find any record in the historical record, any indication of that particular performance. And I found it because Frederick Douglass attended it. So Frederick Douglass attended Ashendaj's concert in Rochester during that period. Rochester's not that far from Montezuma, where Ashendaj and Matthew were. And he says, even though he was proscripted, which means that he wasn't allowed to sit with the white people, Matthew took Frederick Douglass to that concert. I can't clinch that, but I'm telling you that's what happened. Matthew was personal friends not only with William Lloyd Garrison, but also with Frederick Douglass. And he took Frederick Douglass to the concert, and they wouldn't let him sit in the white section. So no doubt Matthew sat with him in the black section, That I can't absolutely nail down. That would require probably correspondence, which we don't have. But definitely Quails saw Ashendaj perform, and he wasn't Ashendaj. Okay, so that's another little smoking gun. I don't have all the graphics for that. I don't think I'll put that in. And they went on and on like that. I mean, I found quite a few of these things. They're all in my books. And honestly, those books may be long, and people may think that they're tedious, but page after page after page after page, I've got detective work like that, things that I found. The things that I'm relating in this video blog, it's just a skimming the top of the surface of what I've written in my books. It's discovery after discovery, I think if somebody gets over their fear and prejudice, it's like the little kid that doesn't like some particular food, that hates bananas or something and won't eat a banana. And all of a sudden, one day somebody slips in a banana and he says, boy, this is great. What is it? And they say, it's a banana. He goes, whoa, but after that, then he realizes, God, I like bananas, So my books are like that. If they just would get into them and read them without prejudice. Because see, if you're prejudiced against something, you're going to be fighting it emotionally and mentally, tooth and nail. You can't enjoy something that you've determined that you don't believe and that you hate. You'll never enjoy that, but once you get over that and realize how fun it is, I think people will find my books a blast. I think they'll hang out with them for weeks like people do with long novels that they really like. That's about it for today. I'm sure I thought this was going to be short, but I keep finding stuff that I wanted to mention. I think I got everything. There was one mistake for the record in yesterday's when I put up a graphic that showed that Matthew used these Peter something, Peter P, Peter Pumpkin, Peter Pumple, Phineas Pica, Paul Pickle, There's a slew of them. There's a whole bunch. Then they're all based on his childhood nickname, Peter Pumpkin. When I put the graphic up there, I repeated the date range twice at the bottom, and it looks as though I'm saying the PP signature went for that whole date range. It didn't. It was actually fairly early that he used that PP, but he used the like Peter Pumple comes in the early 50s or something like that. So he used the double P name quite a bit longer than just the PP signature. I think there's a few PP signatures that come a little bit later, if I remember correctly, but not so much. So I just repeated the date range at the top of the graphic and at the bottom by accident. All right, so I hope some of that's of interest. We actually have like 10 or 11 or something people that have looked at, what was it, a couple days ago? And that was where I talked specifically about B.P. Shillaber and Matthew's close association with B.P. Shillaber and the fact that I have evidence for it. And then yesterday's about Edgar Allan Poe, and one of the pieces that's claimed for Edgar Allan Poe, I think that's had maybe 10 people. So that makes me wonder if scholars who are specializing in certain areas are finding these interesting. You know, if you happen to be a Shillaber scholar and there's like 10, 8 or 10 Shillaber scholars in the world, and they start emailing each other, look, this guy's got evidence, And the same with Poe, people who are interested in that particular piece that's tentatively claimed for Poe, there might be 10 of those in the world, and they're interested, and their friends, they say, oh, I know a guy that specializes in this, and he emails him or something. It doesn't mean people believe me or agree with me necessarily, but it takes time to come around, and my feeling is they're on notice, they've been exposed to the information, and the soup is spit in. That's my way of looking at it. Doesn't mean I'm going to convince people right away. And if I do convince them, they may never admit it. Just being convinced and admitting it are two different things. So once again, thanks for watching.